Our course is entitled Primitive Art. You'll probably find that most of the course will be concerned really with what we mean by those two words, at least in combination. And if you end the course even more puzzled, then I'll regard it as at least partially successful. Because I don't have the answers. And I'd be delighted if we all emerged with a sort of an intellectual hangover. I think one of the most interesting things in anthropology, and certainly in a field as complex as primitive art, is to continually find out that you've been wrong. And that's one of the fun things of being a collector. When you get stuck with a fake, you remember. For one thing, it's cost you a lot of money. If you've reached for it, you don't forget. If you're a curator and you're using government money and you conceal your stupidity, you don't learn quite as fast. And here, I think one of the great advantages of the classroom will be that we can put things out and examine them. Not with any notion that these are the answers, but simply in examination we can see them. That wonderful phrase of Alice, how do I know what I think until I see what I say? I knew a woman quite well who, with her husband, was doing field work in Nepal. And they took a very small child with them who died of crib death. And when she returned, she really wasn't able to handle the thing. And she lived with this problem. And then she saw an article that appeared in Red Book magazine that offered $500 for an account, say a 1,000-word account of a personal experience that had changed a person's life. And she wrote an account of this thing and then was able to come to terms with it. Now, whether this means that the version she wrote was so far removed from the reality that she could walk away, I don't know. I'm not sure what it means. But when you outer these things, you can see them. You know, no one really understood what a grammar was until men became literate. All people spoke grammatically. For one thing, you don't find grammatical errors in speech in a primitive culture. That's the sort of thing you get with us. And people became conscious of it when they became literate, and then they could see what writing was, speech was, language was. When typewriters were invented, dictionary sales went up immediately, because then you could see, you had made it explicit. Now, I think that's one of the functions of the classroom, to make something explicit, not so that we know it to be true, and not so that we memorize it, but so we can examine it and decide whether to go on from there or to walk away from it. So if you'll forgive me, a lot of this course, at least my contribution of it, will be things that I probably would not want to defend at the end of the course. And I certainly will not ask you to accept any of it, other than the fact that we'll just go on in this thing. Let me make a few comments about what we call primitive art. Without going into this whole question of whether we can legitimately call it primitive or not, which I think is much more complicated than most people feel. They object and they say, but you shouldn't call it primitive because it's equal to anything the Greeks produced and so on and so on. Okay. The word primitive, up until the 18th century, originally meant a mythical world from the past. And that is exactly, of course, what primitive art deals with in most cases. It deals with Eden. It deals with the utopia in reverse. It's the effort to reconstruct a world where gods and animals and men coexisted, where wondrous events occurred, and which they hope can be reinstated in this life. And so they will reenact these forms. They will recreate them. In that sense, of course, it's certainly primitive art. And then we have the problem of what is art? Do we mean by the Western notion of a very specific thing, a category, and generally which involves a concentration on one sense to the exclusion of the other senses, so that when we go into an art gallery it says do not touch, and when we go into the library it says silence, and when we go into the concert hall people close their eyes. And we focus more and more on using one sense, and then we have a hierarchy of senses in which as the opening sentence of his most important work, Metaphysics, Aristotle tells us that there's a hierarchy of senses with sight at the top and touch at the bottom. And Plato tells us to trust only the sense of sight. And we say, I'm from Missouri, show me. Seeing is believing, when actually the opposite is generally believing is seeing. Far more fundamental. But in the Western world, there was this notion then that we should focus on one sense, and of those senses, sight was the crucial one. And then we would go down the line until finally we went into what were called the garden senses, or the bedroom senses, the lower senses. And we would not call a cook an artist, or a hairdresser, or a gardener an artist. These were baser senses. An artist was someone who worked with sight and knew how to focus on it just as if it were a target and you were to use your eyes in a particular way. Now that's what we call art. Primitive peoples, of course, have no such concept. But if we mean by art something much bigger than that, if we mean symbolic systems which you can enter mentally and which are functional. Let me give you an illustration of this. Euclid starts with three inventions: points, planes, and lines. Now, there are no points, planes, or lines in nature. The smallest point, nevertheless, is observable that we can make. The strongest steel will bend under the influence of gravity. So what he's come up with are inventions of the mind. Then he subjects those three inventions to the most rigorous rules and comes up with geometry, which is a system in which entire forms and worlds can be created. And you can step into them. They work when you're in there. You can live in them in certain ways. Then you can translate them out into this world here. You can have planes that intersect at 40-degree angles. You can have a rectangle. There are no rectangles in nature. No, not even in crystallography do you have a perfect rectangle. We create this room, we create this building, the whole of New York City is Euclid's creation. Eskimos who have never encountered forms of this type are understandably puzzled by what a rectangle is. And they often have difficulty in even conceiving of such a thing as this room. One of the best stories I know, a true story, involves a Dutch anthropologist named Gebrans, who was working in the Asmat area in West Irian. And the people there had just finished a magnificent house temple. You know, one of these great houses that, well, anyway, looked like this. They looked like huge birds about ready to take flight. And when it was all finished, he said to them, look, I'd like to buy it from you. You make another one. Let me have that one. Well, they didn't understand, but they were agreeable, and so they carefully dismantled it, and they wrapped it all up. And then he explained to them they would have to box it, crated so it could be shipped. And that a ship would come in and they'd put it aboard, but they'd have to crate it. They could not crate what they had created. They had no notion of a surrounding space or a container which would hold something in that form. They had other notions of containers, but not that form, not a rectangular one, and the ship's captain was not prepared to take it aboard ship unless it could be turned into rectangles that he could safely stow aboard the ship. They rotted. They never got it back to light. Now, to pursue that analogy with Euclidean geometry, I feel that what we call primitive arts are symbolic systems. That they begin with certain inventions which do not come out of nature. They are not imitated. Just as phonemes in languages are not imitated. Language does not come from a dog saying bow wow and a man imitating a dog. For one thing, dogs don't say bow wow. And if dogs did say bow wow, that's the last thing you would want to use for the name of a dog. Because the moment you have an imitative thing, you cannot subsume under that category all of the units that you want. So you must start with an invention. And then these formal rules will follow. So one of the things we're going to find about primitive art is that it is always, as far as I know, always, no exception, it is always representational. But what you start with is not a representation of anything you can find in nature. It is a highly stylized form. And the closer it comes to nature, the less satisfactory it is as a working unit. Then the rules will follow from that point on. And the astonishing thing is how carefully primitive art follows rules. This notion that primitive art, comes out of the heart, that it's somebody's brother-in-law on weekends, cutting hair sort of thing, anybody can do it. It's just a spontaneous thing that native peoples can't stop themselves. They just start hacking away and out comes a masterpiece. That they go down into a cave in France and they cover the walls with masterpieces. It's not true. In some of these societies, they had the most formal rules. They had guilds. They used templates. They had master carvers and painters. In the Northwest Coast, we have stories of master carvers being kidnapped, like Renaissance silversmiths. We know that they would sometimes hire people from rival villages simply to get the best, the masters. And they would take these objects out and examine them. They take them out from enclosed areas or hidden away. On the proper occasion, they would be brought out and shown around, and communities who understood their meaning and could judge them would hold them, turn them about, comment on them, exactly the way the Florentines did in the 15th century, when they would put a thing up to display and they would vote on it not by raising their hands, but by their comments. In other words, art then is taken very seriously by the people themselves. And it will follow set rules. These rules are not always easy for us to discover. For one thing, they generally begin by using the senses in a different way. Now, when I speak of our society concentrating on a particular artistic form, so that if I wanted to study painting, I might go to a Picasso. And if I wanted to study music, I might go to Stravinsky. If I wanted to know about physics, I'd go, or mathematics, I'd go to an Einstein. We would accept this notion that each one would be a master in that particular way of organizing thought. Similarly, native peoples would organize their senses. One of the big mistakes in the 60s was the notion of the light show. What we do is put everything in there. It's like a cook who decided, open all the cans, mix. You know, I just came back a few months ago from a trip, a rather unpleasant trip in western Tibet. And one of the people on that trip once took a can of passion fruit and put it on spaghetti. These are things you remember. Now, passion fruit and spaghetti don't mix. In the 60s, they would have light shows in which they would throw in visual images and rock music and poetry and dance costumes, and everyone would be out there. It was all mixed up, and it meant nothing. Sheer chaos. Now, native peoples are going to mix senses often, and they're going to use them in ways that we would never imagine. In fact, we would condemn. But I assure you, it's never a mulligan stew. For one thing, they will often mute sight, where we focus, concentrate, almost take a thing and use it as target, with ourself here, looking at it in this way. They may deliberately mute it. They may approach it with lowered eyelids. They may, in their dance costumes, have feathers coming down, or hair, or hemp hanging down. Or the mask will have only a tiny slit, or the thing is done in almost near darkness, with a bit of firelight. So that our image of these objects as we see them at the Metropolitan with a spotlight on them, in which you stand here, not over here, not over there, but right here. It's almost as if we put an X, as if we were Stalin reviewing the troops, you know, or the Pope out there, right smack dead center and looking forward to it. It's wholly different from what they have in mind. And we can probably never understand these forms in that respect. Now, we take the masks and we cut off all the feathers. We get down there and then we polish the thing up. We get out the kiwi, you know, and we get a nice patina on it, or what looks like a patina. So it looks like a medieval bronze or Renaissance bronze. And then we light it from a certain angle. I even knew one collector who had a turntable, and the thing was slowly, he said, no, sit over here. And then the lights would be dimmed in the room, and he would stand here like some guy with a toy train. And he'd press a button, and this African thing would slowly turn like that. Well, the chances are the object that he was turning was not even intended to be seen by any living person. It was probably intended for the gods, and was put in some sanctuary, some remote hidden place, where the presence of any human eye would be a violation of the object. And even if it had been seen by a person, it was certainly not intended to be seen in that way. Now, there are other curious things that we see. Some of them are very obvious, or they're obvious when you think about it, or have it pointed out to you. Natives will plug their ears when they sing. And if you try that, I won't ask you to do it now, but when you're home and nobody's watching, plug your eyes and sing. And you will suddenly find that the song becomes a tactile experience. You cannot hear it, but you can feel it. And incidentally, if you go to the Carnegie Hall, you will see singers doing that very thing. They're trying to get perfect pitch through vibration. They will turn sound inward and convert it into a tactile thing. Now, we do that in rock music by turning the sound up so high that it can almost produce deafness. But go to a rock thing, you can feel it vibrating. My youngest son took me to hear the U2s. I can tell you the whole damn Madison Square Garden was vibrating. And incidentally, all these kids began to sway. And I don't know what the engineers must think about what's happening there. You know, you could sink a ship by doing that. If everybody aboard an ocean liner starts swaying, you're going to have trouble. You go on a bridge, you can bring the bridge down. You better think twice before going to Madison Avenue for a swaying contest. But to pursue this with the different forms, native peoples will, in their arts, will utilize sensory forms that we deliberately mute. Ever tried to read a book on a beach? The surf, and the bathers, and the nudes, the sand, the wind? You won't remember it. I promise you, you may enjoy it, you may think it's a great novel, but 5 hours later you will not remember what you read. If you were to read a book and remember it for the rest of your life, well, start off when you're young. But go into a corner all alone and have a chair slight distance away from the walls, and everything else around you is quiet and dark. And there's no dog down there licking your hand, and there's no kid interrupting you, and there's no telephone, and you're alone, and you go into that book, and you go right through the looking glass. You go right down that hole, and there's a whole world laid out for you, and you live it. Absolutely. One of the most interesting things is how people in youth can enter that world, and that world can become for them foreground for the rest of their lives. They will think in that world. Their satisfactions will be in that world. And real life will become background and unsatisfactory to them. It's extraordinary. The British were particularly inclined in that direction. For one thing, they would read to one another. And that's even more powerful. You want to remember. Read Kipling aloud sometime. You will not forget it. I had a fascinating experience once. Living with the Eskimos. And I'd have just one of the most wonderful times of my life there. And I had originally gone north alone to join a group of Eskimos that I knew very well, past trips. And when I arrived, of the 16 members of the community, 13 were dead. And I moved on and went further north, and suddenly moved into a community where I was a stranger. And I gave up any thought of doing anthropological research, but I was up there and I thought I'd simply travel. And I moved about with a young man who was a little younger than I was, and we hunted and traveled and moved through Baffinland and so forth. And then we started on a trip out. I was enjoying it so much I didn't want to return. And finally he said, "You must go, or you won't get out this winter, this year." And so we set out, and we headed south, and we were heading toward a base called 30, which had just was being finished at that moment in Dew Line. This was back in 55. And we traveled, I don't know, 500-600 miles by sled. It was just glorious weather. Walt Disney scenes, I tell you. And the colors and the 30-foot ice packs piled up there, and we'd come sliding into a camp there, and we'd swagger into a tent, and then the seals meet over here and the caribou here, and you'd walk in, and the Eskimos never offer you food. That's an insult. That implies you're incapable of hunting. You just take it. You'd cut it off and crack jokes and exchange dirty stories with the women there, and we'd trade dogs, and we'd start on, and we'd just slam this sled across the open water, and you'd come down and get it. The dogs, you throw the dogs over the open water, and then you get ready, and you whip the dogs, and they'd start up, and you jump on the sled and get across. It's a fabulous trip. And when we came to Fury and Hecla Strait, I went into Hudson's Bay Post there to say goodbye to the trader. And he said, "Look, when you cross the strait, there's nothing to do but sleep or read. The dogs know the way, nothing to do." So he said, "Take any book you want, and they're all paperbacks, so don't worry about it." I took Charles Dana's book 2 years before the mast. Now, I have not been reading anything. I'd not been in touch with English for many months, and I had read nothing except my own notes. And so I sat down on the sled, and I began to read this book. And it was an extraordinary experience. You know, I could never duplicate it again. But for one brief moment, I had a notion of what a book means to a person who hasn't read one before. It's a beautifully structured book. Not just well written. It's a book. It's a real book. It's not what you buy in a bookstore today. It's not a laugh book. It's not a ha-ha book. Not a picture book. Not a joke book. Not a travel book. It's a book. A real book with a beginning, a middle, and an end. With a whole notion of an individual who moves through it and perceives and emerges a different person. So, and that experience for me, reading about what Dana was going through in, 1838 or something in California, was more vivid, more real than what was going on right outside me. It's what I could see. The icebergs, the walrus, the seals going by, and so on. I stepped into that world. I'll tell you another story. These things sort of, I can never remember principles, I can only remember stories. But I was working in New Guinea once, and there was a wonderful character there. He was a loser all the way. He'd been in the Second World War, and he'd gone back to Australia, and had become an architect, and there he failed at everything. His business, his marriage. He'd even failed with his mistress, his children, and so forth. And finally, instead of committing suicide, he decided to go back to New Guinea. And he arrived on the Sepik River with nothing to do but join the government service as a carpenter. Well, he couldn't even drive a nail. But he had a great sense of humor, and they gave him employment there. And he had nothing to do except drink, and he wanted to read, but there was nothing to read. And he was desperate for reading material. And so after he'd read all the labels on the tin cans and read the equipment instructions and looked at currency and reread all of that sort of thing, he didn't know what to do. Then he discovered that the local priest, missionary, a Catholic, who'd gone mad, stark raving mad up there, had the complete works of St. Thomas Aquinas. Well, you can't imagine what a relief that was to him. And so here you had this man way back in the bush, drinking too much, but intensely interested in discussing with you some of the finer points of Thomistic philosophy. He could enter that book and survive in that world, but he could not survive in the world outside. Roosevelt Hospital has a clinic founded by a man named Holly Shands, in which they deal with media patients, people who live principally in television and who cannot live outside of TV, who have entered television and found in it all the answers, satisfactions that they need in life, and are so terrified about the world outside where things are not wrapped up in 57 minutes, where the conclusion does not come just before the last commercial. That these people are hospitalized, and when they tried in the past to send them back out to see real people in real lives, they found that they retreated back into it. And we're going to find that these are extreme cases, but there are native peoples who equally will live in their symbolic worlds. There are shamans for whom that world is so real, everything else will seem, by comparison, a shadow. And when anthropologists come along and encounter one of these people, they're either inclined to dismiss it or to treat it as some aberration or something unique to primitive peoples, that they could believe this sort of thing. How can we doubt it in ourselves when we have an acting president? The president of the United States is an actor. I mean, we have totally entered the world of Hollywood. For most people in America today, the characters that they meet on television are more real to them. They get more satisfactions in their relationship with these phantom figures than they do with the next door neighbor, whose name they don't know. So we share that with Native peoples. We share the fact that all peoples live in symbolic worlds of their own creations, and there are no exceptions to that. Incidentally, not even anthropologists. It's one of the wonderful myths of anthropology. We create the same error that Plato did. He thought he had the perfect system that was free from any bias, that through literacy and the scientific method, that he could come up with a record of reality that was translucent, that he could translate without violation, that he was going to ban the poets, he would ban the artists. He did not want that distortion. What he could not see was that the literacy also was a distorting form, that literacy was as much a symbolic system as those that he opposed. Anthropologists fall into that error. There's a wonderful passage in one of Stuart Chase's books when a person is at a cocktail party, meets an anthropologist and says, one of the few people we can trust with power these days. I've never heard an anthropologist disagree with that, and very few of them smile. They are convinced that the form that they have can be separated from the arts. And I think this is one reason why anthropology, when trying to deal with art itself, has been so unproductive. It's a curiosity that anthropologists who almost had an exclusive on this field blew it. You look at most of our textbooks and you see primitive art on the cover, it's generally a souvenir of faith. If you go into anthropologists' offices or into their homes, you'll see the worst kitsch souvenir junk. You don't know whether it comes from Africa or whether it comes from the Philippines, and it really doesn't matter. It certainly doesn't come out of a primitive culture. If you take your average graduate student who's taken a few courses in primitive art and put him down in a real museum, an old one, let's say, put him down in the lower vaults of British Museum and show him specimens, I promise you he won't even know what continent they come from. But if you take him down to Madison Avenue, walk up and down the streets, he can tell you every tribe, every group, everything like that. And why not? Because they were created for him. These are creations that have been made in recent times and that we can deal with. But the real thing, when you encounter it, when you look at the Captain Cook collection, if you happen to be in Washington in the next few months, go see the Wilkes exhibition at the National Museum. It's a real collection. Collected 1837 to 1841. Wow. And read the labels. You'll be very surprised at the pieces. I'm not expressing that very well. What I want to suggest to you is that in many ways we've been misled. When we've tried to deal with primitive art, we found it so startlingly different, so unlike what we wanted, that we've asked Native peoples to make art that answered our conceptions. And we deal largely with things that I call anthropological artifacts, or just plain souvenirs. You know all this stone art that the Eskimo made? No Eskimo ever made that until they were taught by white men how to make it. Do you know these Australian painted forms that are so popular and have now become the symbols of Australia? Except for a few very early ones, which differ markedly from the recent ones. All of this is just a recent creation. Nearly all of the art which is now offered to us is simply taking advantage of of a poorly paid group, unemployed and starving native peoples who hack out stuff to our specifications. We have a long tradition of sending artists, failed artists, artists generally who have a nostalgia for the past. In New York City, there were those artists who objected very much to non-representational art. They wanted to get back to the Andrew Wyeth and the Norman Rockwells and that sort of tradition. And they would go off to Mexico and they would teach the Mexicans how to do it. Or they'd go off to Bali or to the Congo and they would introduce an obsolete art form from the Western world and employ native peoples to do it in their own particular styles. I'll give you another example of this. Some years ago, a woman hit upon a brilliant insight, or at least I thought it was. She noticed that the art forms in colonial Southwest America, South America, and the Philippines employed identical motifs with identical details, and religious forms, and that these changed exactly the same time, in exactly the same way, in each of these three widely separated areas. So she guessed. Prints. Prints sent out by Rome and Madrid to missions in those remote areas. Prints of religious scenes. And we know that prints were, surprisingly, you know, you and I get junk mail and we throw it away. But when prints first appeared, they were thought to be miraculous things. There's one story that Hyatt Mayer tells of an early print that was in a small chapel. The chapel caught fire, and in the updraft, the print was caught, lifted from the altar, went up in the air, and came floating down into the hands of a little girl who was watching, and the whole village shouted, "Miracle." The Dutch, in the late 15th century, late 16th century, I'm sorry, sought a northeast passage to the Orient. They equipped a ship, filled it full of trade goods, and sent it north with the intention of going over Siberia to reach Asia. It didn't work, of course. The ship got caught in the sea at Spitzenberg. It sank, but before it sank, the crew were able to take the cargo off, and then the ship went down and they all died. In 1870, someone found the site with all of this cargo piled up there, and it created a certain stir back in Holland. Here were all these 17th century or 16th century specimens. And then more recently, they went back to see if anything was left, and they found large blocks of ice. And they took these back to Holland and thawed them out. And I believe they found something like 2,300 prints now, and been able to identify, 95% of them, well-known prints. In other words, prints were being used as trade objects, inexpensive trade objects. Here in New York State, trade goods penetrated as far west as the Genesee Valley by 1540. And beginning about that point, you get a very unusual thing among the Iroquois, of the Western Iroquois, the Seneca, Cayuga, and the Susquehanna. And these are what are called September morn figures. These are nude maidens in a posture of modesty. Now, if there's any one thing that does not occur in American Indian art, North American Indian art, it's sex. You see it, if you see sex or pornography, I promise you, it's not authentic. It's a souvenir, it's a fake, it's simply hiring Indians to make dirty things that white men wouldn't make for themselves. But here you have then this classic Western notion, the modest maiden, which is very Hellenistic, is basic to the Western world. And it's a very clever artistic device. What is sexier than nudity and modesty combined? I'm convinced that these are images of Eve. And that I went to the Vatican to see if I could find prints that dated as early as 1530, 1540. Well, I found dozens of them. It didn't take any search. I mean, Eve was a very popular figure. And how does she stand? She stands like this. My guess is that traders, unknown traders, never mind the licenses that the royal families issued and all of that nonsense, always there's somebody who heads in way ahead of time, sneaks in. There were Basques along the Grand Banks there, probably within 10 years after Columbus. The Canadians have now located and identified a ship, the Don Juan, 1537, complement 75 men, cargo, whale oil. There were sometimes up to 20 ships in the harbor there at a time, as early as 1540. My guess is that early traders came in here and they brought with them prints. And one of these prints dealt with the Virgin Mary, not the Virgin Mary, but dealt with Eve. And the Iroquois then executed this as a protective device. Really what I'm saying, and I don't want to get lost in the details of the illustration, is that the moment Western art, or any powerful art, Islamic art, the art of the Huns, Scythian art and so forth, hits primitive culture, it generally takes over. The traditional arts are then forced into a sub rosa role. And with Western art, it's very fast. We can tell the difference between the artifacts collected by Captain Cook on his first, second, and third expeditions. By the third expedition, they were waiting for him. They've been hacking out souvenirs in all of the preceding years. Nowadays, when you go into primitive cultures, societies, they generally have workshops there. There was the May Company here in New York some years ago decided to go into primitive art on a big scale. And so they had some woman collecting in a secret, but there's just so much great art there to be collected, and anyway, it's too valuable to sell to May Company customers. So they set up sweatshops along the Sepik and up in the Maverick district, and they literally had assembly lines and processed these things, and at the end of the line they put them in the termite heaps to have them eaten away, and then they'd take them out of that and they'd put them down in pits and cover them with lime and build fires on top, and then they'd get up. It was a wonderful thing, and you could process this whole thing, and these were sold throughout the United States. And there was one very popular form. It was a figure about this high. You'll see them around. New York is probably loaded with them. And it consists of a human figure with a bird on top, thus symbolizing religion or man and nature or something, I don't know. And half of them have erect, they're male figures, have erect penises, and the other half have dangling penises. And the May Company only were able to sell the erect ones. And so they were left with literally hundreds and hundreds of these unpopular forms. And I was teaching at the University of California, UCLA at the time, and they offered, I don't know, 700 of these dangling ones to the university. And I was asked to make a financial evaluation of the thing, and I pointed out that I thought this was eminently suitable to our faculty. It's art designed for us, representing us, and the offer was rejected. Anyway, I don't want to make too much of this, but I think the point is so basic here that if we want to know primitive art, we have to go back and find it on its own terms. And we must try to discover its meaning to the people for whom it was originally intended. We can do anything we want to with it. We can see it any way we want. I remember once talking to a collector and explaining to him how the thing was meant, and he said, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested only in what it means to me. Fine. But in this course, we'll try to take another approach. We'll try to discover what its meaning was to the people for whom it was first intended, and how it was used, and how it was seen, and what function it had in their community. And I think we will generally find that the answers we come up with are not particularly interesting to us. I'd better warn you in advance. Many of our writers, Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, have discovered things that will simply warm you. I mean, they'll tighten your sinews. The meaning of this, native peoples had this in it, don't believe it. They are not students at Sarah Lawrence University. They are not middle-class housewives in Vienna concerned with some of their problems. They are natives working out their own lives, and the questions that concern them are of total indifference to you and me. Most of these questions involve rebirth. If there's any one thing that they seem to focus on, it's how to get back here. You know, we can have stories about the Hindus and others who accept the fatality of life and who hope to achieve nirvana. Forget it. I've never met anyone who really wanted to call it quits and pull out. That's just a full front. It's sort of a Las Vegas trip. Last year I worked on a film in Benares. Now, I've been to Benares before a number of times. I used to like it, but the more concentrated on this and all this garbage about death being a higher state, and that once freed from life's turmoil and so forth, you could rise up. Forget it. I mean, it was a con act, and they were making money out of it. And there's a marvelous film. I'll get it if you want to see it. We'll show it here in the film that was made on this project. You won't see it, I promise you, on television. And none of the filmmakers will probably be invited back to India. But the one thing that you're going to find in primitive art is they are asking how to improve their status here. What auspicious play will give them a better throw of the dice? How can they be reborn? What will guarantee their rebirth? Or another basic thing, that they're special, that they have a claim, a genealogical claim that goes right back to the first one. They are divine, they come from the sun, they do this, they do that, and so forth. And it is not this notion that our Western psychoanalysts have given us, that all of the world that will make us complete can be found in the primitive world, rendered there. You just sit back, they'll show you exactly how primitive it is. It's not true. I'm sorry. You know that wonderful phrase of Oscar Wilde, that Wordsworth found in stones the sermons he had hidden there. Well, we have been using primitive art for that purpose for a long time. We've discovered all those things we really wanted to push, but didn't want to identify as private philosophies, as our own way of seeing. And so we asked native peoples to mouth these for us. They'd be quite astonished, I assure you, to hear that sort of thing. We're also going to have to accept the fact that people are not the same everywhere. This is the new school. It's not the University of Chicago. At the University of Chicago, you learn that all people are alike. You're basically alike, and therefore you should like them. The reason we should not discriminate against people is that they're like us. Some use chopsticks and some don't, but they'll give it up. You give them a crack at a fork, and they'll accept that you can have them to dinner. I think people are different, and I think those differences mean something to them often. I don't mean that those differences are always commendable. We're going to find many things in primitive societies that I personally don't like, not that that means a damn thing. But the notion that the anthropologist is going to go into the field and just have warm and happy thoughts about the holy, I'll confess to you something that rarely comes out in an anthropology course. I haven't liked most of the people I've lived with. Some of them I've intensely disliked. I was living in one village in New Guinea once in the Central Highlands, and I said to my wife one day, the goddamn chief comes to the door, I'm going to take this club and knock his head in. I thought they were the coolest people I'd ever met. They used to have trials out in front of my house. I call it my house, it was their house, but I was paying for it. And they deliberately had it right out on the lawn there to take advantage of my presence and make this thing even crueler. And they would take one another. You talk about women's lib, and you don't. Women in our society who think that the primitive is the ideal, who now talk about this early state when man worshipped the female deity, come off it. I went into one village once, and the first day I was there, I heard the most god-awful scream. And a woman was screaming, and I didn't know what was going on. And it was pouring rain outside, and I was totally lost in the village. And the next morning, I went to the chief, and I said, look, I've got a land rover here. You have a problem, you come. We'll go to the hospital. It wasn't a woman having a hard delivery. It wasn't someone who was having a leg amputated. They were just knocking the daylights out of this person. And this battered woman the next day was driven out of the village. And why were they driving her out? They alleged that her pig had broken loose and gotten into somebody's garden. But the fact is, they wanted to get the bride price back. And I think we will find that people are different. And I don't simply mean that they have different attitudes. I think they perceive differently. They have different relationships to reality. They perceive their own role differently. There are many languages in this world that conjugate, people will conjugate and decline from plural to singular, not singular to plural. Makes a big difference. We say 1 and 1 make 2. There are people who think that out of 2 you can extract 2 ones. They will begin with whole and they will deliver this single thing. We would never think of that. We assemble and we begin with the I, which by a wonderful coincidence also is the I. And we proceed on many of the, there are languages here that have no adjectives and no adverbs. There are many languages which lack tenses. And these are not shortcomings of language. The very languages which do not have the forms which seem so crucial to us will have forms for which we have no counterpart. Very few languages, except Western literate languages, have the equivalent of our verb to be. There's no such verb in Eskimo. Nevertheless, Eskimo is immensely complicated. You could not, for example, in Eskimo, simply refer to these keys as keys. I could refer to these keys on this table, and in which there would be a subordinate and a role here, one of the other. But in describing it, I would also have to involve myself and the listener and my relationship to the listener. And I have no other choice but to do that. And I don't do it by ending up with sentences that long. I can have what Eliot calls a word that is a poem. I have no choice in this. I must, in the grammatical forms of expression, define those forms in that way. Just as you and I are forced in English to deal with tense. And if we avoid tense, we're stuck with the spectral form, which is its own special way of dealing with time. But I must cast it in past, present, or future, or withdraw from that form and make it eternal. In Eskimo, you have no such obligation, but you do have an obligation to deal with space. So that you and I will get all mixed up of different things in space and different possessions. He put on his coat, and we don't know whose coat he put on. And we have preposterous things that we end up with when we say, it is raining. What else can rain do? And why would I use the verb is, since existence is implied in being? So what I'm really saying there is rain, rain, raining. I will say the lightning flashed. It must. Why not simply say lightning? But hidden in these things that appear to be absurd are basic assumptions which we require. And we assert must be made dealing with all experience, where we will deal with a cause, that everything has a cause. And from that we believe everything has an effect. And it will follow. Now, those of you who lived with very small children know how difficult it is to convince a child that everything has a cause. A child, is in a room, he walks past the table and accidentally knocks a plate on the thing and it smashes. The mother comes in, how did that happen? No, it just happened, it just broke. And the mother thinks he's lying. And later on, he's going to learn to be a member of our society that everybody has a cause and he's guilty. Now, I'm talking much too much now. Any discussion on what we're going over? I know from past experience that a course like this can be very frustrating. It's going to get more so. For one thing, the longer I've been in anthropology, and I must tell you, I went on an expedition when I was 13. I've been doing it a long time. The more and more skeptical I've become of anthropology. So I've had a long time to become skeptical about it. And I don't feel that the methods of anthropology are as fruitful as we believe. They have something to contribute. They can be very good. And at certain levels, they were wonderful when they boys took a stand against racism. And when anthropologists began to deal with, areas of experience and data that normally people didn't deal with. And when anthropologists felt that the whole world was theirs, nobody staked out, nobody wanted primitive culture. Who wanted primitive art? The great Hooper collection was put together by a man who inspected toilets, sanitation inspector. He had nothing. He had no rug on the floor, no painting on the wall. There's scarcely enough food. And he put together a collection in his lifetime for nothing, which when he died sold for over $4.5 million at auction. You could do that because no one took it seriously. A course in primitive art, a course in primitive peoples in 1900, when the first course was introduced at the University of Pennsylvania in 1903, the dean called in this young instructor and said, 2 courses? Is there really enough material in anthropology to offer 2 courses? And the instructor said, sir, I didn't mean to offend you. I was just asking. Of course you can teach 2 courses in anthropology. So anthropologists could have the whole field. They dealt with mythology, they dealt with art, they dealt with music, physical types, and without boundaries, they allowed all of that information to mix. It's a marvelous moment. More of them, none of them were trained as anthropologists. That was the best thing. They were lawyers. Boaz was a physicist. They came out of left field. They were like civilians during the war who knew how to do a job and get it done and go home. And so without any bias and without any training, they came in and they experimented. And these were the big breakthroughs. These were the moments when they could send out expeditions and hire the most diverse people. When Boaz did his great Siberian study, he got prisoners in Siberia to do the famous Chukchi, Gilead, Yupikir reports. These were Russian noblemen condemned to Siberia with time on their hands. And they went out and, as aristocrats, at least they could find native peoples they could look down on. And they made those wonderful studies. They still remained aristocrats who were looked at. Marvelous thing. Incidentally, some of them came over to meet Boaz, and they really liked it here, and they stayed. And one stayed on and became a librarian in Brooklyn and died there. And if you want to study Koryak culture, you have to go to Brooklyn now to do it. So the Russian scientists now come over here and study in Brooklyn to learn about the culture that's since disappeared in Siberia. Well, I'd like to emphasize one other point. I think that a great ethnography is more than simply the discovery and assembly of data. Great ethnologists do more than record, they reveal.